Welcome to another Tidbit. I'm Dr. Paul Petersen. We are focusing on the theme, the concept of covenant in the Bible. This is the second quarter of 2021, and we are looking at the Bible material for study provided by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, a covenant, let us summarize. A covenant with God is always on the initiative of God himself. God is revealing himself to us. He is coming to us. A covenant is therefore a covenant of grace. And revealing himself to us, God shares promises. This is the first element, promises of grace. Then there's a second element of the covenant, that is the conditions upon which we are to live if we are to be in his covenant. And as a third element, there is a ratification, a confirmation, making the covenant legally binding and real. That confirmation is the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Now, as we have looked at the covenants so far in the Bible, we've noticed that when God established his covenant with Israel, he also gave them a large number of laws. And these laws, it's possible to categorize. You have ceremonial laws that pointed to the cross of Christ, the sacrifice of Christ, and to Christ's high priestly service in the heavenly sanctuary. So all the ceremonies connected with the tabernacle and later the temple pointed forward to that particular new covenant where Jesus, as the perfect sacrifice and the ideal high priest, serves in the heavenly temple. These laws had a temporary function. They were a shadow. Then you have a set of laws that were concerned with how Israel were to live in the land that God gave them. That is, laws that were connected to the theocracy, to God's people as a nation, as a state, as the remnant of the Jewish people became the Christian church. And people entered God's people, not through circumcision, but through baptism and personal choice. The concept of the Christian church or God's people as a state was abolished. And all the laws concerning the theocracy lost their function. Many of these laws are built on moral principles that are still valid, but they are not binding because the people of God is no longer to be a state, no longer a theocracy. But the laws that were not abolished, that are still valid, are the laws expressed as the grand moral principles which we find in the Ten Commandments. Last time we read some text, Deuteronomy 4:13-15, and from Nehemiah chapter 9, that showed how there already in the Old Testament is a clear textual distinction between the Ten Commandments and all the other laws to be kept in the land that God gave the Israelites. The narrative setting reveals to us that the Ten Commandments are unique. The New Testament usage does the same. In Romans 13, Paul is quoting from the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are expressing the moral foundation. And in the Old Testament, like in Deuteronomy 4, verse 13 and 14, and in the name, the Ark of the Covenant, we see that the Ten Commandments become the covenant itself. It is the foundation for the covenant. Don't get me wrong. When Jesus speaks in Matthew 22, verse 34-40, about the love law of love as the real law, that is the love for God and the love for fellow man, he is not, as some Christians would say, replacing the Ten Commandments. No, he is actually quoting from the Old Testament, showing these are the principles on which the Ten Commandments and all the other laws build. Because the Ten Commandments themselves are divided into two sections. One section, the first 4 commandments, if we follow the Reformed or Calvinistic accounting, one section, the first 4 commandments, deals with the relationship to God. The second section, from the 5th to the 10th commandment, deals with our relationship to fellow man, build on the love for God and the love for fellow man. This love is a great motivation, and this love comes because we have been redeemed. We only love because he loved us first. This is expressed in the very 10 Commandments themselves. As we look at Exodus chapter 20, we find that the first words spoken by God are the following: I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. In other words, the 10 Commandments are given to a people who has already been redeemed. Redemption comes before obedience. We love because he loved us first. No merit, no salvation by works. So let's take a look at this foundational law for God's people everywhere at all times. We will look a little more on the Sabbath in particular next, for our next tidbit, but let's look at these commandments. First, when we count 10, the first of the 10 and the last of the 10 complement each other. The first commandment, as interpreted rightly so, I think, by Martin Luther, you shall have no other gods before me. That first commandment speaks about faith, confidence. You are to trust God and God alone, no other. This is speaking not about particular acts, but about my attitude. And in the same sense, the last commandments, you shall not covet, doesn't speak about any particular act, but about my attitude. When Paul in Romans 7:7 summarizes this second tablet of the law, he does it by quoting this particular commandment: you shall not covet. It summarizes, if that is your attitude, you will not steal, you will not murder, and so on. So the first and 10 commandments speak about the law as more than just external acts. There are still some people who seem to think that transgression of the law is only by a specific act. Let them read this a little closer. But as you then move into the center of the 10 commandments, and you look at the last of the commandments dealing with our relationship to God, and the first of the commandments dealing with our relation to fellow men, you find there is a commonality also. The Sabbath commandment speaks about my origin. I am created by God. The 5th commandment speaks about my human origin. That is, about my father and my mother. That's where I belong. That's where I originated. And these 2 commandments are exactly those 2 that are expressed in a positive sense. Not you shall not, but remember the Sabbath. Honor your parents. So, let's look at the first 4 commandments a little more. The first one is like the absolute. Only one God, none other. This is then expanded in the following 3 commandments. They actually expand the commandment of having no other God than God. The second sounds like this: you shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of their fathers to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Let me return to this particular phrase of punishing, but at first highlight. This has throughout history been related, of course, to building of images, sculptures and so on. The context is in order to worship, because that was what people did back then, and some places they still do. But of course, in a spiritual sense, or the deeper meaning is you are not to make a God in your own image. You are to worship only God as he has painted himself for us in Jesus Christ. So no other God also means no other God than the God that the way he reveals himself as a person in Jesus Christ, revealed through Scripture. The punishment. Now the Hebrew pakat actually doesn't mean punish. It means visit, and in some context that is punish, but here it is follow closely. If the sins of idolatry continue until the 3rd and the 4th generation, then God says stop. It's actually an extension of his mercy, not the other way around, so that just because my parents did something wrong, I will be punished. That's a misunderstanding of the text. So the first commandment says no other God. Then the sphere is expanded to include the religious sphere, the sphere of worship. Now it is expanded even more with the 3rd commandment: you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. The language here is forensic. So the obedience to one God only is now expanded from the religious to the forensic sphere as well. I shall not use religion as a cloak to exploit, to oppress. I shall not use God in the context of law to get my personal will. And then, of course, in the 4th commandment, the concept of worshipping, believing in only one God is expanded even further into our social settings, into the Sabbath, where I stop working because profit is not my God, where I let that rest also be a reality for my servants, slaves and so on, even for the animals, because profit and material wealth is not my God. God alone is my God. He comes and visits me, and the freedom that he gives to me, I need to share with anyone else. That is how God is. So, next time we will look more at the Sabbath commandment. For now we will say the 10 commandments are universal principles intended to be followed by all God's people everywhere throughout the history of this world. They are the core moral principles of the covenant of God, based on love for God and love for fellow men, a love that springs out of the fact that we have already been redeemed. Thank you for listening to this tidbit, and welcome back as we continue our study next week.